I never imagined my tears would lead to something that would change my life forever. That day, I wasn't just overwhelmed with emotions, I was completely broken. Everything around me felt heavy, like the world was pushing down on my chest. I was sitting in the empty classroom, long after the final bell had rung, when my teacher walked in. I tried to wipe my tears quickly, pretending I was okay. But he saw right through it. And that's when everything started to shift. My name is Emily, and I thought I had a normal life. I was married, trying to balance home and college, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. My marriage had lost its spark. My husband had grown distant, cold, and always too busy. Conversations turned into silence. We barely looked each other in the eyes anymore. But I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that things would go back to how they used to be. Deep down though, I knew something was broken. Then came Professor Hale. He wasn't just any teacher, he was the kind that remembered your name, looked you in the eye when you spoke, and actually listened. He made you feel like you mattered. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, teachers are supposed to be kind, right? But there was something different about him. The way he noticed when I wasn't myself, the way he never pushed too hard but always showed up at the right time. And on that particular day, when I was falling apart, he sat beside me, not as a teacher, but as someone who cared. He didn't ask for details. He just placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, and that simple gesture made me burst into more tears. I hadn't felt safe like that in a long time. We didn't speak much in that moment, but the silence between us said everything. I didn't know then what was coming next, how that one quiet afternoon would lead me down a path I never expected. It started with innocent conversations. Quick hellos turned into long talks after class. I began to look forward to seeing him, not because he was my professor, but because he made me feel seen. He remembered the smallest details about my life, noticed the sadness I tried to hide, and offered a space where I could just be myself without judgment. But as the weeks passed, that connection began to grow into something deeper, something I tried to ignore. I told myself I was just lonely. That I was only craving attention. That nothing would happen. But when your heart is aching and someone comes along offering the comfort you've been begging for, it becomes harder to draw lines. What happened next took me by surprise. It blurred the boundaries of right and wrong. And in the middle of it all, I found myself caught between a love that once was and a feeling I never thought I'd have for someone I wasn't supposed to fall for, especially not him. And that's when everything started to unravel. After that afternoon in the classroom, something shifted inside me. I tried to convince myself it was just comfort I felt, just gratitude for someone noticing I wasn't okay. But the truth was harder to admit. Every time I saw Professor Hale, my heart beat faster. I started dressing with a little more care on the days I had his class. I paid attention to the way he spoke, the way his eyes stayed on mine just a second longer than needed. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew I was slipping into dangerous territory. At home, things kept getting worse. My husband, Ryan, was still distant, more like a roommate than a partner. We barely spoke unless it was about bills or groceries. He didn't ask how my day was, didn't notice when I was upset, and definitely didn't notice the emotional war going on inside me. Sometimes I wondered if he already knew we were drifting apart and just didn't care enough to fix it. I started questioning if he was being faithful, but I had no proof, just that awful gut feeling that something was off. And all the while, my connection with Professor Hale kept growing. We never crossed any lines, but there was something unspoken between us. It lived in the pauses of our conversations, the way he would linger in the hallway just to say goodbye, or the way he'd always find a reason to ask how I was really doing. It was subtle, but it was there, and it was powerful. I wasn't sure if he felt it too or if it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he understood me in a way no one else did. One day after class, he offered to walk me to my car. It was raining, and I didn't think much of it at first. We talked casually, laughing at something silly a student had done earlier. But then he paused, looked at me in a way that made my breath catch. I froze, unsure of what would happen next. It was one of those moments where time slows down, and every choice suddenly matters more than you expected. He didn't say anything. Just gave me a small smile, wished me a good night, and turned back toward the building. But I stood there in the rain, heart pounding, wondering what it all meant. Was I reading too much into it? Or was something truly growing between us, something I wasn't ready to admit, but couldn't deny any longer? I didn't know it yet, but that moment would come back to me again and again, especially when I found out the secret that changed everything. The days that followed were filled with questions I couldn't silence. I kept trying to make sense of what was happening between me and Professor Hale, but there were no clear answers. On the surface, everything still looked normal. I was a married woman trying to keep up with school, and he was just my teacher. But underneath, emotions were getting harder to hide. Every little interaction between us carried weight, every smile, every glance, every pause in conversation felt like it meant more than it should. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Like the way he would avoid eye contact when others were around, or how he made sure our conversations stayed light if anyone else was nearby. It was like we were both pretending nothing was going on, while silently admitting to ourselves that something definitely was. And yet, nothing had happened, not really. There were no crossed lines. But the emotional connection felt real. Too real. At home, things were beginning to fall apart faster than I expected. Ryan had grown more secretive. He kept his phone on silent, started coming home later than usual, and barely made an effort to connect with me. One night, I asked him directly if something was wrong between us. He brushed it off, saying I was imagining things. But his coldness didn't lie. I wasn't imagining anything, he was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. And worse, I was beginning to wonder if I even wanted to. My best friend, Clara, noticed the change in me. One afternoon, she asked if I was okay. I wanted to tell her everything, but how could I explain that I was emotionally attached to someone I had no business caring about? That I was holding on to a connection that scared me and comforted me at the same time? So I lied. I told her I was just stressed with school and life. She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. One evening, after a long day, I stayed back in the library to finish an assignment. Professor Hale walked in, surprised to see me. We talked again, softly, carefully. He asked about my writing, then my life, and I felt the same pull all over again. But just as we were about to part ways, he said something I wasn't expecting. "There's something I need to tell you. But not here." His words hung in the air like a cloud I couldn't see through. What did he mean? What was he hiding? And why did it feel like my world was about to tilt even further? I walked away that night with more questions than answers, unaware that the truth waiting for me would shake everything I thought I knew. The next few days felt like walking through fog. I couldn't focus in class, couldn't sleep at night, and every time I looked at my husband, I felt like I was living a double life. My mind kept going back to Professor Hale's words, "There's something I need to tell you." He hadn't followed up yet, and that silence made it worse. Was he backing away? Had he sensed my confusion? Or was he waiting for the right moment to say something that might change everything? I tried to carry on like nothing was wrong, but the pressure was building. Ryan was still distant, almost like a ghost in our home. One night, he came in late, smelling faintly of perfume. It wasn't mine. When I asked where he'd been, he snapped at me, said I was being paranoid. But his guilt was written all over his face. I didn't have proof, but my gut told me the truth I didn't want to face. And yet, I wasn't sure if I had the right to feel hurt. My own heart was already somewhere else, tangled up in feelings I didn't ask for. Then came the afternoon that shifted everything. Professor Hale asked me to stay after class. I told myself it was probably about an assignment or something routine, but I knew better. The classroom emptied out slowly, and once the door closed, he looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. He sat down, took a deep breath, and said my name in a way that made my stomach drop. I wasn't sure if I should say this, he began, his voice quiet, steady. But I can't keep it in anymore. I froze. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. He paused for what felt like forever. I didn't know if I wanted him to keep talking or stop right there. Every part of me felt torn between fear and curiosity, between right and wrong. But just as he opened his mouth to speak again, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. You deserve to know the truth about your husband. Check your inbox. I blinked, staring at the screen. My hands started to shake. Professor Hale noticed and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. I opened my email. And what I saw made my world tilt. Everything was unraveling, all at once. 2 truths, 2 betrayals, and 1 impossible choice standing between them. And in that moment, I knew everything was about to change. The email was short. Just 3 photos. No explanation. No name. But what I saw in those images stopped my breath. My husband, Ryan, was sitting at a restaurant, smiling across the table at a woman I didn't recognize. Her hand was on his. The last photo was worse. It showed them walking into a hotel lobby. Together. It felt like someone had punched me straight in the chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. Professor Hale kept asking if I was okay, but I just stood there, frozen, staring at the screen. Finally, I whispered, "It's Ryan. He's cheating." Saying the words out loud made it real, and my knees almost gave out beneath me. But the timing, it didn't feel like a coincidence. That message came just as I was about to hear something important from Professor Hale. Why now? Who sent it? My thoughts were spiraling, but he gently led me to a chair and sat across from me, his face filled with concern. And then he said something I didn't expect. "I didn't want you to find out like this." I looked up at him, heart racing. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, like he was trying to choose the right words. "That woman in the photos, she's not just anyone. She used to work at the college. And she's my ex-wife." I stared at him, trying to process everything. My husband was cheating with his ex-wife? That couldn't be real. It sounded insane. "How do you even know?" I asked. "She left me 3 years ago," he said quietly. "For someone else. I haven't seen her in a long time. But a few days ago, I heard from a friend that she was back in town, and not alone. When I saw her with Ryan, I didn't want to believe it. I didn't know how to tell you." The room felt like it was spinning. My heart wasn't just broken, it was tangled in something way bigger than I had ever imagined. My personal pain was now part of someone else's history. And it made everything more complicated. "I didn't want to interfere," he added. "But I couldn't stay silent either. That's why I asked you to stay today. I didn't know how to say it, because I didn't want it to look like I had a reason to pull you away from him. I didn't know what to say. My husband's betrayal was already too much. But finding out that it involved someone connected to the one person who had been kind to me? That made it feel like the ground beneath me wasn't real anymore." I walked out of that classroom with no clear direction. Just questions. Why would Ryan get involved with her? Was it just random, or was there something deeper? And more than anything, why now? But that wasn't the end of it. Later that night, I received another message from the same number. "If you want to know the whole truth, meet me tomorrow. Alone." My hands trembled. The pain, the lies, the strange connection between all of us, it was no longer just about infidelity. It was something bigger. And I wasn't ready for what I was about to uncover. The next day, I barely slept. My thoughts were all over the place, about Ryan, Professor Hale, and the strange message asking me to meet alone. I didn't tell anyone. Not Clara, not even Professor Hale. I needed to find out the truth for myself. That afternoon, I drove to the address that was sent to me. It was a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where secrets didn't echo too loudly. I walked in with my heart pounding, scanning the room. Then I saw her. The same woman from the photos, the one with Ryan. She was sitting by the window, sunglasses off, a cold coffee in front of her. As soon as our eyes met, she waved me over like she'd been waiting for this moment all along. "I'm Melissa," she said simply. "I suppose we have some things to talk about." I sat down, every part of me tense. She didn't waste time. "Ryan and I have been seeing each other for a few months," she said, her voice calm. "But he didn't tell me he was married. Not until last week." I stared at her, confused. "So why send me those pictures? Why now?" She leaned in, her eyes serious. "Because I found out something else. Something you need to know, about your husband, and about Hale." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" She pulled out her phone and showed me a message thread between her and Ryan. The truth hit me like a wave. Ryan had planned to get close to her. Not because he loved her, but because he found out about my connection to Professor Hale. He knew we had feelings, maybe he didn't know how deep, but he knew enough. And Melissa, unknowingly, had become part of his plan to trap us both. It wasn't love. It was revenge. Control. "He told me he wanted to catch you slipping," she said quietly. "That if you cheated first, he'd take everything, your name, your finances, your peace. He even joked about setting Hale up." I felt sick. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore. It was strategic. Calculated. All this time, Ryan hadn't just drifted away, he had been watching, manipulating, waiting. I left the cafe in shock, heartbroken but clear-headed. I called Hale. I told him everything. And together, we made a decision, to confront Ryan and end the game he thought he was winning. That evening, I walked into our apartment with Hale by my side. Ryan looked stunned to see us both. For once, he didn't have the upper hand. I told him I knew everything, the affair, the setup, the manipulation. I saw his face change, the confidence drain from his eyes. But just as we were about to walk out, Hale turned to Ryan and said something I wasn't expecting. "I knew Melissa was back in town. But I didn't know she was your sister." Ryan froze. My heart dropped. And suddenly, everything made even less sense. This wasn't just betrayal, it was family. And now, I was caught in the middle of a secret I hadn't even begun to understand. The room went silent. I stared at Ryan, waiting for him to say it wasn't true, that Melissa wasn't his sister, that this was just another twisted trick. But he didn't deny it. He just looked away, jaw clenched, breathing hard. That silence told me everything I needed to know. It had never really been about love or betrayal. It had been about control, power, and keeping me small. Ryan had used his own sister to mess with my emotions, to keep tabs on me, to trap me. But somewhere along the way, Melissa had figured out the truth too. And when she realized she was being used just as much as I was, she decided to expose it all. I walked out that night and never looked back. I filed for separation the next day and started therapy to heal from everything I had been holding inside for so long. It wasn't just the infidelity, it was the emotional manipulation, the gaslighting, the lies stacked on top of more lies. For the first time in a long time, I started choosing myself. Professor Hale and I remained in touch for a while. We talked, shared a few quiet moments, but agreed it was best to give each other space to heal separately. What we had shared was real, but it came at a time when everything else was falling apart. It wasn't fair to start something new on the ruins of something broken. As for Melissa, she left town a week later. She sent me one final message before she did. I didn't know how much damage she was causing. "I hope you find peace. You deserve better." It was strange how all our stories had twisted together, me, my husband, his sister, and a man who simply saw me when I was invisible. What started as an emotional connection became the spark that led me to the truth. And in the end, it wasn't about who cheated first or who was right. It was about learning to recognize when love turns into control, and when silence becomes a warning. This wasn't just a story of infidelity, it was a story of rediscovery, of waking up from the fog and finding clarity in the middle of heartbreak. If there's one thing I learned, it's this: when your world starts to fall apart, sometimes that's the very thing that sets you free. 12.